Yes. Okay. So, as I said, today's agenda is very straightforward. We have to cover the Second World War. And once we've covered the Second World War, then we move to the Cold War. Now, please understand one point, which is that cause of the First or Second World War is relevant. Again, the course is again very, very long when it comes to Second World War. Very long course. It's a long war. And then significance. And ironically, the significance of the Second World War is the Cold War. So, whilst for the First World War, you have cause, significance, and the Treaty of Versailles being the significance, and what all we see as the causes of the Second World War is also the significance of the First World War. These are connected wars. So, World War One, interwar, and World War Two. World War One, you need to know the cause. Significance is basically the interwar period. The interwar period also becomes the cause of the Second World War, and then the significance of the Second World War is the Cold War. So it's a sequence in which they are answering each other in that regard. So today, what we do is that we start the war, how Hitler started the war, and then we have to discuss Cold War politics. And on Monday, we will discuss colonization, decolonization. And on Tuesday, we can cover if something is left. Other than that, we'll have the doubt session specifically. Everybody has to be there. And you have to send your doubts to iaslive@byju's.com. Okay. Now, let's talk about the war itself. Please understand cause, significance, cause, significance. Cold War, the question changes. The type of question changes for Cold War because the Cold War is not about cause, significance, about 3 to 4 important points, high points in that story. Now, if you remember, you can send after Monday's class today, whatever you want to. Where if you have a doubt related to any module which we've covered, you can send it right now also. Just keep the subject as world history doubt. Now, we have discussed yesterday how Mussolini rose, how Hitler rose. We've discussed what is fascism. We've discussed what is the Great Depression. Now, there's a certain context which you need to understand. Is that when we talk about the war, the following are the causes. I have to discuss one more cause with you. That is why I'm writing this down. One was the fact that the Treaty of Versailles was the problem. Second was fragile democracies, which I will show you how it played a role. Then we have Great Depression. Then we have the concept of messed up map of Central Europe. And fifth, we had fascism. But one more reason, yes, sure, socialism. Seventh, USSR's aggressive policy towards spreading socialism, false sense of security. Now here I want to add the ninth point. And the ninth point would be called the policy of appeasement of Britain and France. See, we don't associate Britain and France with guilt. We don't associate the English with having a conscience, but somehow they developed one in this period, wherein the British Prime Minister Chamberlain, he was the most biggest appeaser in that sense. Somehow the British and the French, based on the very harsh clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, developed a certain guilt in themselves, and for that reason they were ready to maybe accept a lot of things which Hitler was doing, which may not have been acceptable previously. So I'll give you a very simple example. What Hitler's first action was union with Austria, but it was directly written in the Treaty of Versailles, union with Austria is not allowed. But the British and the French were like, let them take it. Let Hitler take it. We were too harsh on Germany. That is the core concept which develops, that we were too harsh on Germany. So they, in a way, appeased, or in a way were happy to keep Hitler happy, which Hitler will misuse and then start the war. And this is basically a guilt which these two countries developed, specifically Britain under Prime Minister Chamberlain. And this will be one of the major causes why Hitler will keep on increasing what he wants. So they thought that maybe Hitler will be happy with taking Austria. That was something which we did wrong. Then say that, okay, let's give him Czechoslovakia also. Maybe he will not say anything after this. So it's like a small, what we call as a naughty child, when you take him or her to the toy store. At first, he will pick up a small toy. You will think, okay, sure, I just slapped this child. So, okay, one toy is okay. However, then he will touch another, a little bit more expensive toy. And you'll be like, yes, I slapped this child 3 to 4 times. Maybe 2 is okay. But now, after that, he will touch a very big, expensive toy. Then you will think that this is going out of hand. So that naughty child is Hitler. He kept on increasing his demands, and that in turn led to the war itself. But that tolerance for that had to come from the British and the French, which had developed a certain type of appeasement policy towards Hitler. And that was one of the reasons why Hitler was able to do what he was able to do. So appeasement policy of the British and the French, which was generally the way they handled Hitler, was one of the major causes for the war. Are we clear with regards to what do you mean by policy of appeasement? I will show you. I will demonstrate this appeasement to you. But when I say policy of appeasement, this is what I mean by it. Okay. Now, let's see how Hitler, between 1937 and 1939, started the war. How he started the war. Now, the first thing was, Hitler always argued that the Germans are getting suffocated. The Germans are getting suffocated. And the area which you see in dark is only what Germany was. Now, by the time 1938 comes, 37, 38 comes, Hitler had become very popular. He had systematically started to defy the Treaty of Versailles also. He stopped the reparations after 1933. After 1933, no reparations were sent. After 1933, he was also making smaller but very significant batches of aircrafts, saying that they're commercial aircrafts. Further, he was training his pilots in commercial aircrafts for combating or battling. He was also increasing the number of army. If you remember, he was only allowed 1 lakh. He was slowly but surely increasing the number of people who were trained in army training generally. So he was very systematically creating the context for going to war, and he wanted Central Europe first. And he was that, in that sense, the Nazi army was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger with the Luftwaffe. Luftwaffe, the name Lufthansa, Luft means air. So Luftwaffe, which is his air force, he was making sure that the Air Force becomes a very important component of his army or of his Air Force. So Luftwaffe, Navy, he never actually gave a lot of emphasis to, but Luftwaffe and armored divisions, which is tanks and what we call as armored cars, he was very, very concentrating on that sector. So by the time Hitler thinks of Austria, he was already seen as a German hero, that he was bringing in the glory of Germany back. The Third Reich will be for 1,000 years. This Reich means rule. The third rule of the Germans, the Third Reich, which was created after Hitler captured power, will remain in power for thousands of years. Germans will now rule the world. They have been humiliated, they have been in a way belittled, and the revenge was coming. And in that context, the first act which Hitler will do is that he will take and he will add Austria to the German state. So now he's done something very, very, very straightforward, but in defiance with the Treaty of Versailles. And at this point of time, France or Britain could have intervened. France and Britain could have intervened. However, their guilt, which they should not have developed, they never developed a guilt for India, but they developed a guilt for Germany. And therefore, this guilt allowed Hitler to take Austria without too much resistance. So he really did not have any resistance from any state when he took Austria. And the Austrians were also extremely happy. He himself was an Austrian. Very, very happy that Hitler, the Nazi army, has entered. Now Hitler adds Austria to his empire. The German empire is expanding and Lebensraum is at work. However, what is the problem with Austria right now? What is the issue with Austria? And if you have to fight a war, you need resources. For resources, you need industries. So what is the problem with Austria? Yes, very good. Austria is wholly agricultural. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the industry is not with Austria, but is with Czechoslovakia. Is with Czechoslovakia. So now he has to find a way to take Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia will be the way in which he can add an industrial zone into his empire, thereby expanding his production capacity. Now, for that, now Hitler starts a drama. And the drama is that there is an area here. This whole area which you see in yellow, this area is called Sudetenland. This area is called Sudetenland. This is a small sector in what we call as Czechoslovakia, and this is a German dominated area. Major German population is there. And now Hitler starts to do a drama, which you would have seen today also in a lot of context it is used. He starts to say that the Germans in the Czechoslovakian Sudetenland area are getting discriminated. That the Czechs are not allowing Germans to live peacefully and they are discriminating against the Germans. It was zero, nothing like that was actually happening. Neither was Czechoslovakia doing anything to these Germans. But now Nazi propaganda will be flooded into this sector that Hitler is angry and Hitler will not let this injustice happen. Now, across Europe, Hitler will now start to broadcast messages that if Germans are discriminated against, Hitler will not sit alone or sit without any action in that sense. Now, Britain and France can see that Hitler is becoming a little bit aggressive. And he's saying that if Czechoslovakia does not, yes, Czech Republic and Slovak is today Czechoslovakia, Hitler is very simply arguing that if these Germans are not given full right or if they are not given to Germany itself, he will attack Czechoslovakia. And he then started to also show that the Czechoslovakians are doing aggression. How? He used to actually kill 2 to 3 people in the morning, make them wear Czechoslovakian army uniform, and then kill them in near the border and say, see, the Czechs are trying to infiltrate into Germany. The Czechoslovakians used to say, these are not our men. They did not have any ID cards, but that didn't really matter. It was about creating a public opinion that the Czechoslovakians are also doing aggression and the Germans are getting, in a way, discriminated. So you can see he's trying to create a certain image which he will use to then argue against Czechoslovakia in front of Britain and France. Now, Britain and France can see that this can go out of hand very quickly. So, based on this concept, Czechoslovakians were mostly clueless. They didn't know what was really happening. Based on this, there will be a conference which will be established, which is called the Munich Conference. This is considered a very interesting conference in 1938. And in the Munich Conference, what happens is that Britain, France, Germany, which is Hitler. Hitler says, I have a very good friend, usko bhi bula lo, he'll also enjoy. And Italy, which is Mussolini, met in Munich, in Germany itself. Now, one country is missing. Which country are they actually talking about? They were not called only. Czechoslovakians were not called on the negotiating table. This whole conference was about resolving Czechoslovakia, Germany. But Germany did not allow or did not, in a way, created such a narrative that Czechoslovakia, Britain and France said, no, we will negotiate for Czechoslovakia. Now, at the Munich conference, what is decided? It is that Sudetenland will be transferred to Germany. So Hitler got his way. That this whole sector will be given to the Germans. And the Munich conference is considered very iconic because Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and the French Prime Minister all were together. And on the sidelines of this conference, there will be a what we call as a treaty or pact which will be signed between Britain and Germany, which is called the Treaty of Non-Aggression and Mutual Non-Aggression between Britain and Germany. And this moment in British history is considered very ironic because when British Chamberlain or British Prime Minister Chamberlain comes back to Heathrow, which is in London, he then waves that document and says that I have ensured peace in our time, not knowing that within 1 year the war is going to start. So Hitler was very categorically working in such a way that he was able to convince that I will take Sudetenland. That is the only solution. And however, Britain and France were still appeasing. They were still allowing Germany to do what they wanted to do. And more than that, the Munich conference was seen as a watershed moment because all these powers were together for the last time in a way. And Chamberlain, in a way, gave a very ironic picture to us who have seen this story or who are actually studying this story. So the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Britain and Germany was seen as a breakthrough at that point of time. So the pact, the Non-Aggression Pact, was seen as a breakthrough. Now, based on the Munich conference, the Czechoslovakians are obviously not very happy, specifically the Czechs. Based on this, Hitler is going to enter this area. Hitler is going to enter this area. But Hitler did not want to stop here. He wanted whole of Czechoslovakia. Now, after taking Sudetenland, Hitler will now start to argue that I can see that the Czechs are also discriminating against the Slovaks. The Slovaks are getting discriminated, and I can't let the Czechoslovakians do the same thing to the Slovaks as they've done to the Germans. And on the pretext of helping the Slovaks, and the Slovaks did not ask for help, Hitler will take whole of Czechoslovakia. Hitler will take whole of Czechoslovakia. Now, you can see this was not under the Munich conference. So, within 3 months of the Munich conference, he defies the Munich conference and takes Czechoslovakia. Now, you can see that the British and the French are showing a lot of tolerance to what Hitler is doing. That guilt is not allowing them to intervene into what Hitler was doing generally. And somehow Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister thought, and British and the French thought, that now maybe Hitler will stop. Now, maybe Hitler will stop, that he's taken what he needed to take and he'll stop. That was the hope which Britain and France wanted, because everybody was coming out of the Great Depression. Nobody wanted a war again. They thought, why fight a war again? Because then that will create depression itself. Then everybody wanted to avoid war and everybody wanted Hitler to stop. But Hitler was not going to stop here. He could see that he could get away with anything. So he was just basically checking the limit till which Britain and France would allow him to do what he was doing. So giving him Austria and Czechoslovakia showed to Hitler that he could do anything when it came to Central Europe. And in the ominous year of 1939, August, he will now look towards Poland. But for taking Poland, he has to take one person into confidence. And that is this border, which is with USSR. So Hitler contacts Stalin and says to Stalin that basically Poland should not exist. Poland is either USSR territory or German territory. And he says to Stalin that I am going to take Poland. I will take it from the west and I encourage you to take it from the east. And let us come to this border, which will be our border, not the Polish border. So basically, he took Stalin into confidence that we will attack from both sides and let's move to the old areas we used to have, or that border which we used to have previously. Stalin obviously already hated the West, agreed, and now Hitler will start to do the drama. And the drama will be that he will say that this part of Germany is not being able to connect with this part. You see how messed up they made a map. In order to give Poland access to sea, they gave this city Danzig to the Polish. But that split Germany into two parts. That small part is also Germany and that part is also Germany. Now Hitler started to do a drama that I want to connect these two parts. So I want a railway link between these two. So you do one thing, you give me Danzig. Danzig is a port, yes. So you give me Danzig. He said that I want this sector so that I can connect the two parts of Germany. But here Poland could see what Germany was doing. Poland did not give anything. Poland was even urged by the British and the French that give them Danzig. They will not do anything. We'll give you another port, don't worry. But Poland knew that how Czechoslovakia was conquered. It is First give him a small territory and then he expands. Poland, seeing that Hitler could do the same thing what he had done to Czechoslovakia, Poland goes into a treaty or a secret alliance with Britain, that if attacked, Britain will help Poland. And Hitler could see that Poland is not budging. And by September of 1939, he had now started to mobilize his army on this sector. And on the fateful night of 1st September 1939, he will attack Poland. And as soon as Poland will be attacked, unlike Czechoslovakia, the world will respond. First, France will declare war against Germany, and then Britain will do the same. And now the Second World War has started. It is Germany and Italy on the same axis. That's why they call the Axis powers. Germany and Italy on the same axis. These two Axis powers have now started a war with the world again, and the Second World War has started. So the story is very straightforward. First, he takes Czechoslovakia. Then he tries to connect these two parts together, which is Germany and the other part of Germany, through Danzig city. Danzig was demanded by Hitler, a rail and road link with East Prussia. This is the East Prussian sector. Poland were cautious. They could see what had happened in Czechoslovakia. Britain had already guaranteed help if Poland was attacked. Thus, Poland remained adamant and Poland was not ready to give up. And this will basically trigger the war, because one after the other, the war will start, and this will be the first act of the war. Now, to give you the causes of the war, we've already done it. We know that people did not like the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles created problems for everybody, for minorities, for the way they had messed up the map, the issues related to resentment. Fascism was created because of that only. So we know that extreme nationalism or ultra-nationalism developed because of that only. We also know that the League of Nations, which is this collective security curtain which was on everybody's eye, was lifted up by Hitler in 1939, and the world was again at war. And the global economic crisis, which is basically the what we call as Great Depression, was also important because it divided Europe into two parts: dictators and democrats. Dictators wanted war, the democracies did not want war, and therefore they followed a policy of appeasement in order to make sure that the economic situation of none of these countries was there to fight a war within the next 20-25 years. But Hitler forced everybody's hand. Now, till this point, I hope it makes sense. You don't have to know these intricate details, how he started the war and all. But I hope that you understand how he first did drama in Czechoslovakia, then he started in Poland. Because if that is the case, whatever I'm teaching right now, you just have to enjoy it and understand it. It's too long to be written in the examination. I have to read till Cold War. Whatever I'm discussing is just to give you a glimpse of the war. Right? Okay. Now, can I now discuss the war with you? Can I discuss the war with you? Yes, sir. Okay. Now, one thing very, very clearly you need to understand, that I am going to tell you which powers are involved in which year, because you will ask me, where is America, where is this, where is that? 1939, 1940, 1941 onwards. 1939, it is basically Britain, France versus Germany and Italy. If you want to add, you can add Poland, Belgium, Netherlands. 1940, this will remain the same. Same countries will be involved. It is in 1941 that Britain, France, USSR, USA versus Germany, Italy, and Japan. So understand this point, that the first 2 years of the war, it was only Britain, France, and Germany and Italy. USA, USSR, and Japan get involved only 1941, and they will go until 1945. Till that point, we will discuss it. Now, I have to explain a method which made Hitler so ruthless, and that is called Blitzkrieg. Now, I'll tell you why Belgium. I'll tell you first. I'll show you maps. Why USSR from the Allied powers? Pooja, all that questions I will tell you. That is why I've already written it down. So I know you would be looking for USSR. I will discuss when did USSR enter, why did USSR enter. Don't worry about that. Yes, Japan was an ally entered against. All these questions will be answered. First, listen to. Now, September of 1939, Hitler started the war. But there's a problem. There's a problem. See, 1914 to 1918, which is the First World War, was a trench war, which is having trenches and holding lines. This type of war is very slow. Slow war, and movement is also very slow. This also realizes on old technology, or relies generally on what we call as old technology, which is that you have the trenches in the forward line, and basically telephone lines used to be there connected to the headquarters. So the lines used to be connected through telephone wires, and it's an old type of warfare. Now, Shayans, that is of no purpose to you. That is optional level, because that needs a totally different orientation. Now, when we talk about Hitler can't afford a long war. Hitler can't afford a long war because the Germans, the French, France, and Britain, if there was a battle of production means who can produce more guns, will A win or will B win? B. France and Britain have colonies. France and Britain are the largest economies. And France and Britain have the production capacity for what we call as a war of attrition. War of attrition means who can produce more. The problem with Germany is that it has limited resources, no colonies, and if I want to say that, for example, if this represented the strength of the German army, if this represented the strength of the German army, the French and the British had an army which was 5 to 6 times bigger than Germany. So the army of Britain and France was extremely big. Germany still has resources, but a head-to-head fight between them, Germany will start to struggle after a point. Germans may have coal, but Germans don't have petroleum. The point is that outright war between these two sets is never going to come into German favor until unless Germany has very good colonies which provide Germany with the basic resources. See, in a war of production, nobody could defeat Britain in the long run. And remember, Germany had been given war reparation. Germany had lost a lot of territory also. Germany had been humiliated. It was having too much instability. So Germans and Hitler understand this point. Hitler could never have won and would never want to get indulged in a war which was a long war. That for 5-10 years he's fighting. That war he would never win. Hitler needed quick victory. The more quickly he wins this war, the more guaranteed it is that he wins the war in the totality. So understand this point, that resource-wise, Germany is rich, but it is not in comparison to a colonial power like France and Britain. So now Hitler cannot afford trench warfare. Hitler cannot afford trench warfare. Rather, Hitler needs to develop a new type of methodology, which is called in what we today call as lightning warfare, or the word is blitzkrieg. Can I discuss this new technique which Hitler developed? What does colonial power mean? Countries which have colonies. Is everybody here? Can we go into this aspect? No, it's not like surgical strike. It's not like that. Okay. You want to write blitzkrieg, whatever want to be write. You change you make it like this, doesn't matter. Now, see, there are three principles of blitzkrieg. Speed, modern technology, and swift movement and victory. Speed and ambush, modern technology, and swift movement and victory. And the basic principle of blitzkrieg is win without fighting. Win without fighting. I'll give a very simple example of this. See, this is the border between France and Germany, and the French have deployed regiments along this line. Regiments means that there is deployment of the army. Now, any day France has a much bigger army, but the foolishness which the French did was that they started to prepare for a trench warfare. They thought standard trench warfare, the way we fought with Germany last time, we'll do it trench warfare. And all of these what we call as regiments were connected to Paris via dedicated telephone lines, And the technology right now is still telephones, which the French use. Germans, on the other hand, have tried to change their technology, which I will tell you what it is. Now, Germany, if we talk about Germans, they have a big army, but it cannot take on the French on each and every line. It can't take the French on each and every point. So if this is point A, point B, point C, point D, and E, the Germans can't fight with the French on all these points. Because maybe they have a strong infantry here. The planes, the Luftwaffe, which is its flights will also help this whole sector. The problem is that they are nothing in front of the whole French army. So, as per traditional warfare techniques, Germans should have spread the whole, what we call as army, across this line and then fight a war. But rather, Hitler's army, through their research and through their understanding of the border, this is the Air Force. Through their border, used to find the weakest link in any of these points, which is the deployment A, B, C, or D, or E, where if you hit, you could easily break through, but maybe you would have to fight, but the war would be small or would be quick. Prima facie, it seems as C. Because here the deployment is the lowest. They thought that the mountain range which will basically protect them, but the Germans were ready to go any lengths to hit the weakest point. So rather than hitting at all points, the Germans will concentrate force here. Now the first principle works. Which is speed. Now it's not like they will first deploy 10,000, then they will deploy 10,000, then they will deploy 5 aircraft, then 10 aircraft. No. They take all of this, close to 1 to 2 lakh men, move towards point C, and then they burst into the French territory. So the whole power is concentrated in this sector. One go. First, the tanks enter, then the aerial bombing starts, and thereafter the infantry enters. So there is left, right, and center proper chaos which the Germans create, which is that you don't know what to do. The tanks have entered, the infantry has entered, the air force is also bombing. So there's constant bombing. So the close air support helped the German army very well. And maybe this army was not enough for the whole sector. C can get defeated quickly because it's an ambush. And they used to do it in the night. Overnight till 12 a.m., till 11:30, they used to mobilize everything to a point. And then, because there's no satellite technology at this point of time, you can't see the movement that way. They mask the movement till this point. And then at midnight, first the bombs start to drop, then the artillery starts, then the tanks enter. So imagine that the whole Indian army, the whole of Indian Air Force, the Navy and all other forms of military infrastructure we all mobilize it to the Gujarat sector, and one go we enter into Pakistan. Now Pakistan will not know what to do itself, and France also did not know. There is intelligence, but the Germans use a very strong code. It's called the Enigma code. Enigma is a coding which the Germans use. And for the first 4 to 5 years of the war, nobody could break this code also. It was so difficult. It will be Alan Turing who will do it, but only by 1942. So right now, even if the French are intercepting the messages of the Germans, it is in such a encrypted code that nobody understands it. Now this ambush, this lightning warfare, what they do is they break this sector. But the first thing which they used to do was that they used to go and cut all the telephone lines. And the Germans had developed by this point of time a two-way radio. The way radio signals work, the French were still using what we call as telephone lines, but the Germans were using handheld radio. Now what happened was that the people who were sitting in Paris now had no idea what was happening on the border itself. There was no communication only. And now once the Germans have broken into the line itself, now what they do is that they attack these regiments from behind, from where they were not expecting any ambush itself. So basically, Blitzkrieg ambushes the enemy and creates total chaos. And the principle was what? Win without fighting, which is that proper fighting they don't want to do. They just want to enter and overwhelm the enemy itself. Overwhelm the enemy itself so that that person cannot respond only. For the first 3 years of the war, nobody had an answer. At least first 2 years, nobody had an answer for Blitzkrieg. France, Belgium, Netherlands, and whole of continental Europe felt the heat of the Blitzkrieg, and Germany was able to very quickly win things which it had not been able to do in the First World War. But I hope now you understand what is Blitzkrieg. Yes? Come on. Okay. Germans used Blitzkrieg, involved a surprise attack using rapid overwhelming concentration of force, includes land, infantry, and armored divisions. Close air support was given. Method was to break enemy lines and used unbalanced force to quickly annihilate the enemy. How was that easy? It is always easy. Attack at the weakest point and then concentrate the force. Attack the regiments from where they're not expecting and basically create chaos. As I said, Hitler needed to do this because Hitler, prima facie, face to face, had a very small army vis-a-vis France. So he had no other option. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for the students, just one thing, the students who are extremely interested in how the war happened. This is in the slide number 174 till the maps which are given in the end. This is by month summary of the war, which is start with Poland, guaranteed, honored, Soviet Union. This is the month by month summary. So this is for your reference. If you are extremely interested, this gives you every event which happened month by month between 1939 and 45. So you can read it, don't have to learn it. It's totally for your curiosity. So that you don't go to a source which you don't know. So anybody who wants to till the surrender of Japan, this is basically month by month. It is not important. It is for your reference. That's it. It's only for your reference. And now I want to discuss how the war actually started. So can I now discuss through the maps how the war went on between 1939 and 45? Yes? Okay. As you can see, two very, very extensive war is they will only ask cause significance. They can't ask you to explain the whole Second World War. Nobody can do that. Why didn't the other regiments surround him? Because there was so much chaos and there was no communication between regiments. All telephone lines were cut. So therefore, nobody knew what was actually happening in that sense. And there's no satellite imagery or GPS at this point of time. But you know that they didn't know that the Germans had broken into French territory in that sense. Now, let's talk about who cut the telephone lines, the Germans. Let's talk about the year of 1939. Now, 1939, what Hitler has done is that he had already entered Czechoslovakia, and the start of the war is by taking Poland. Now, Poland had no idea how to manage blitzkrieg. A very important thing which the Germans used to do was to bomb all the airports so that their air force becomes useless. They took out most of the communication channels, and the armored division of the Poland or the Polish, the tanks were also destroyed within hours. So the Polish had now fallen, and as promised, Stalin had also invaded Poland from the other side. But the Germans are now holding in a way Poland and Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia already he had. Now Hitler turns his attention towards France. The French, after taking Alsace and Lorraine, again started to do a blunder, which is that they started to fortify this line. This is called the Maginot Line. Maginot Line is the area, is this Maginot Line. They started to fortify this area, that the Germans are going to come from here. But the Germans will pull off a trick twice on the French, and the dumb French will not realize that if the Germans did not come in the First World War through this line, why would Hitler come through that? So rather, Hitler enters into Belgium and then into France. Same exact thing which was done in the First World War. And he now takes Belgium and Netherlands. Belgium and Netherlands again are going to fall very quickly. They will fall back because what he had done was that he used to take lakhs of soldiers through very small sectors through which the enemy had no idea how to respond also. And ironically, between 1930 and 40, June of 1940, Hitler was able to do something which his precursors were not able to do, which is that Hitler reached Paris. His strength was his Panzer tank. You would have seen tanks, but his tank was interesting. His tanks did not have tracks, but it had tires. So his tanks did not used to move very slowly. Very quick movement tanks were called. This is the Panzer series of tanks. Panzer tanks gave him very swift action, speed, gave him a lot of speed. Now, when the Germans will enter France, France will surrender in June of 1940. June of 1940. Tanks, not tanks, tanks. Tanks are armored division. So tanks are a very important part of what we call as infantry support, armored division. And the fallback of France was very ironic. In the same carriage in which the Germans had surrendered to the French in 1918, Hitler will call the French generals in the same same railway carriage and say, sign your surrender. Sign your surrender. And by June of 1940, Belgium was gone, Netherlands were gone, and whole of France had now been conquered by Hitler. In this, there is a very iconic moment which is called, from this point, called the Dunkirk evacuation. The French, British, and Belgium and the Netherlands army were falling back. Holland, Netherlands, same thing, were falling back, and they reached to a point called Dunkirk. Dunkirk was a small port and a beach in France, and the British had to evacuate close to 3 to 4,000 soldiers out of this area. If not, the Germans would have slaughtered each one of them. There's a movie also on this, Dunkirk. Christopher Nolan captures that moment in which Blitzkrieg was wreaking havoc throughout France. So one thing is very, very clear. If we call it the opening act, between 1939 and June of 1940, Hitler was winning this war comprehensively, and he had done what previously was not possible, which is to take France. However, now his problems start to rise, because he now wants to take England. He wants to take England. Now, a mistake which Hitler did whilst doing this, and what the French also did before they surrendered, was that most of the air force bases and airports of France were destroyed either by the Germans or the French destroyed them, so that the Germans could not take off from France. Now, a German bomber had a range of 4,000 to 4,500 kilometers. And the distance between these 2 points is close to 2,000 kilometers. So now the problem which Hitler has is that his bomber can go to a certain point till England, and then it has to come back to refuel in Germany itself, because there is no way to land in France. So based on these chances, in 1940, we see the Battle of Britain starts. Battle of Britain will start. Now, what the Germans wanted was that they wanted to take England, but English had a strategic location, and though the Germans were able to take off and bomb most of this sector, Hitler was not able to go beyond this point, because his bombers did not have the right range to do it. He needed a bomber to go to at least 6,000, 7,000 kilometers. So the city of London, it was literally bombed day and night, but the English moved most of its critical infrastructure towards the north, knowing that the Germans can't reach there. But in the Battle of Britain, now Hitler will start to get frustrated, because there was no conclusion which Battle of Britain was bringing in. Something which started to happen in 1918 also, in that First World War also, 1914, that this sector was now going to become a stalemate. The Germans can reach a certain point. The Royal Air Force also destroyed a lot of his bombers, but the Battle of Britain was not going anywhere generally. There was no way that Hitler could reach the critical infrastructure of England. He could not invade England, and as it is, he did not have a navy. So naval warfare again was one thing on which the Germans were not very good, unlike the First World War. First World War still U-boat campaign very well, but Second World War, he has submarines, but they are not proper regiments. So now Hitler is getting frustrated. Hitler cannot afford a war for a long period, and by this point of time, Britain and France also start to realize that Hitler is in a hurry. Hitler is in a hurry. If we can prolong the war, then this will become a war of production and attrition. And Germany can never win against the British and the French when it comes to production. So the concept was frustrate Hitler in this sector and as much as possible delay. As much as possible delay. And Hitler did start to get frustrated because he did not want to fight a war for 5 to 6 years. But that is what is basically going to happen with him also. Now Hitler, out of the frustration of Battle of Britain going nowhere, Hitler will now change his orientation. Hitler will tell Italy that you do one thing. You take Greece and you take Egypt. You take Greece and you take Egypt. So Hitler sends a message to Mussolini that go and capture Greece and Egypt. I want to close the Suez Canal. I want to close the Suez Canal. And whilst Mussolini was very good in orating things, while Mussolini was very good in making all the drama which he could do, Mussolini was not, the Italians were not good at fighting. Ironically, the Italians will start to lose to the Greek army, and Italy will also lose to the old style Egyptian army. Now Hitler will literally every time say that why is that Germany gets useless allies, and Germany would then have to actually send troops to Greece and troops to Egypt. But this is called the mushrooming of the war beyond England, beyond Europe. And basically, the Egyptian and the Greek campaign, once the Germans get involved, they were able to take this sector. They were able to take this sector. However, Hitler does not have one resource which he needs very desperately. Hitler needs one resource which he needs desperately, and that is petroleum, crude oil. Petroleum is needed for the Air Force, petroleum is needed for the tanks, the petroleum is needed for most of the army itself. And now Hitler, who had thought that he'll take Britain, he'll take the colonies, he is now stuck. He's now stuck. He's been fighting the war for now 2 years. He could have stopped here, but that was not Hitler's plan. He wanted to now go a step further. And in the year 1941, Hitler will do a blunder out of desperation, which even Napoleon had done. Hitler will now say that I want to now take Russia. He said that the USSR is the country which has most of the resources when it comes to petroleum. This sector was very petroleum rich, Ukrainian sector. Now Hitler, what he will do is that in the year 1941, Hitler will go for what is called as Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was invasion of USSR. Now, whilst taking Egypt and Greece, one mistake which Hitler did, which again Napoleon had done, that is why people say that if Hitler had studied history, he would not have done the same mistake as Napoleon. He had delayed it to the autumn and the winter season of Russia. And Russia, their winters is their most important weapon. Now, tell me one thing. There are 3 very important cities here. One is called Stalingrad. The other one is called Moscow, the capital, and the other one is called Leningrad. Now, if you are the military general of the Nazi army, which city should you go for first, or should concentrate your army towards? Which city? Moscow. You should have a full-blown attack on Moscow, because that is the epicenter, that is the what we call as the capital itself. And if you attack the capital, you take everything. You take everything. However, Hitler did not do that. Hitler chooses, on the other hand, one second, chooses on the other hand, give me a second, yes, okay. Yes. Chooses, on the other hand, a three-pronged attack. Three-pronged attack, which is that he would go one from south, one from north, what is called Trishul formation, and the other from the north itself. Why didn't he buy from, you think that the Stalin is going to sell oil to Hitler? He knew who Hitler was. And Hitler thought that socialism is a sham. I will just enter into Russia and I will break Russia. Now, basically, he's done this three-pronged attack for a very simple reason, because he wanted to enter this sector and take the oil. Now, whilst Hitler was very good in capturing this area, his Moscow and Stalingrad campaign were not very good. And there were three major issues which will emerge automatically when he'll enter into USSR. Hitler had underestimated the USSR. His calculation was that the USSR has 1 crore army, 10 million. But USSR at that point of time had a 30 million army. 3 crore men could be deployed by Russia at any point of time. And that he started to realize that when his blitzkrieg started to go through the Polish sector and the initial industrialized sectors of Russia, of USSR, he had already captured 50 lakh men. Still 2.5 lakh men were left. So he had thought that he'll just enter USSR and Stalin will just plead to his ground and say that don't kill me, take Russia. But the Russians, what they used to do was that they used to just do the same thing, scorched earth policy. They used to just abandon the cities, burn the cities, burn all resources, so that the Germans cannot even get food or shelter anywhere. Thereafter, the second issue was, see, the Panzer tank, which has a lot of this tire, this works very good in the roads of France, of Italy, of Germany. These are very good paved roads. But when you go into a battlefield like Russia, which has no metal roads, it has all rural sector, these tires are useless, because they will now start to get stuck into snow or into mud. And the first principle of blitzkrieg was what? First principle of blitzkrieg? Speed. There is no speed, because the armored division could not move very quickly itself. That is why you would have seen Russia tanks always have tracks. They always have tracks. Those tracks are important because they are able to, there is, Tulsi, there's no SME in this session. So don't ask for the PPT. I can't give it to you. You'll get it. So I'm not able to receive PPT because there is no one. So don't post in a doubt section. Do post here. Post here in the chat section straight so that I can see it. So don't do that. I can see some of you are just posting there. Don't do that. So let's not get caught up into things which don't matter right now. Listen to me. So you will get the PPT. Everything will be there. Listen to me. I have only 2 hands. So I can't also send you the PPT from the back and also teach you. Can't do that. So wait. Now, the speed principle was destroyed by the fact that his tanks were never geared for winter warfare. Further, once it becomes extremely cold and windy, the Air Force could not also actually get involved. So Luftwaffe became useless. And basically all the principles of Blitzkrieg were actually getting destroyed or null and void in the USSR sector. And that is why we believe that the Operation Barbarossa is seen as the turning point of the Second World War. Because now Hitler is stuck in both fronts. There he can't take Britain, and on this side he can't take USSR. USSR had very specialized forces for what we call as winter warfare. He used most of his tanks used to seize as soon as the winters became -10, -20. The Russians used to go change the oil and the coolant of the tank and use the German tanks on the Germans itself. So Hitler was actually overwhelmed by the way the Russians were giving resistance, and Hitler will be stuck for 2 years in Russia. Operation Barbarossa will happen between 1941 and 43. And he will thereafter also lose the Battle of Stalingrad, lose the Battle of Leningrad, and he will not be able even to take Moscow itself. But if you look at it, between 39 to 41, Hitler was in a very good position. Battle of Britain was the first frustration, and Operation Barbarossa was the foolishness out of that frustration. But in 1941, one more foolishness will be done. Can I discuss that other foolishness by a very small Asian power, which is to take up and wake up the monster? Okay. Now, whilst all of this is happening, they are playing Blitzkrieg and they're playing this game called the Second World War. Japan does a very big blunder. See, whilst all of this is happening, Japan thought that why not take the colonies of these imperial powers whilst that means Russia defeated Germany. Yes, USSR was given single-handed credit, and Stalin should be given credit here. Stalin basically took the brunt of Nazi army, and he absorbed the shockwaves of the Nazi army. He lost a lot of men. Close to 1.2 crore people died in Russia because of the Nazi army. However, Russia absorbed all the pressure which Nazi army or Hitler was exerting. Hitler was exerting a lot of force, and that France could not absorb. None of the other European powers could absorb. However, the USSR was able to absorb it. For 3 years, the Russians kept on fighting. That much capacity no country had at this point of time. And that is why the USSR after the war said that I want my place in history. And I am the reason why Hitler never went forward. But Hitler always had useless allies, and therein comes Japan. Japan became a very opportunistic power and a very aggressive power. And from 1941 onwards, or 41 onwards, it started to basically use the weakness or this engagement of Europe within itself to take the colonies in the Southeast Asian sector. We already know they had Manchuria, they had Korea. And now the Japanese will start to move downwards into the Malayan Peninsula. And this you would have done in your modern India, that the Japanese became extremely aggressive in the Southeast Asian sector, and they were starting to remove the British from their colonies itself. However, as soon as the Japanese became aggressive, Philippines was an American colony. Philippines was touched by the Japanese, and the Americans did not like it. And the Americans basically put in an economic sanction on the Japanese and started to intercept the Japanese ships also. However, the Japanese said, okay, you want to take a target at us, हमसे पंगा लेना चाहते हो. And what they will do is a blunder in 1941, which is called Pearl Harbor. The Japanese will bomb and have a surprise attack on a small harbor, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which is an American, what we call a city and district. And at Pearl Harbor, America will lose close to 3 battleships, 350 aircrafts, and 3,000 men will be killed in and around Pearl Harbor because of the surprise attack of the Japanese. And now when this will happen, America will now enter the war in 1941. Now, once the Japanese had done this blunder, America enters on the side of the Allies, as it always did. So Hitler then contacted the Japanese and said that now that you are on the other side of the Allies, you can work with us and make sure that you can take away the British power in the Southeast Asian sector. And that is why after 41, they become even more aggressive. But the Americans had already entered the war, and that creates the context for the Quit India movement, that the Japanese became even more aggressive once they went into an alliance with the Nazi with the Axis powers. But why am I saying that it is a blunder? Because do you think that Hitler really needed the biggest industrial power, the creditor of the world, the best in technology, and the most untouched country at this point of time to enter the war? No, Hitler's plate was already full. Now the Americans will enter the war in 1941-42. And thereafter, the tide of the war will change. Between 1942 and 45, first thing which the Americans will do is give a befitting reply to the Japanese in what is called, and everything is written in the PPT, I'll read it out to you also, that is called the Battle of Midway Islands. The Americans will be able to defeat a much bigger attack by the Japanese because they were able to intercept their code and they were able to understand what they were going to do. By that point of time, the English, Alan Turing, will break the Enigma code also. And now they will start to understand what the Germans were actually sending as messages. And then will start the liberation process. First, Egypt and Greece will be liberated in what is called the Battle of El Alamein. Once that is done, then comes the battle of or the invasion of Italy. And here the Italians will be overrun by the fresh American army and Italy will be taken. But Hitler will very quickly move to Rome so that Rome does not fall. And now the Italians were fighting on the side of the Allies, and Mussolini was removed by the king and later killed. Once Italy was with the Allies, now comes what is called D-Day or Battle of Normandy, which is the liberation of France. America will now, with the help of the British and the French forces, start to liberate France. And once liberation of France will be done, by May-March of 1945, they were poised for the invasion of, rather by February of 1945, they were poised for invasion of Germany. Hitler had no way to go, and from the eastern side, USSR will invade Germany, and all from the western side, Britain, France, and US will invade into Germany from the south also. And once the counter-offensive did not work, Hitler will shoot himself and commit suicide. And by May of 1945, no Berlin Wall, Berlin Wall is Cold War. By May of 1945, Germany had surrendered. However, the Japanese still had not surrendered. They were still over smart. They said, no, we will not give up. And by this point, the Manhattan Project had developed the first nuclear bomb, and also Fat Boy, and the 2 nuclear bombs will be developed. And now the Americans will try to send a message to the world. And the message to the world was, we have a nuclear bomb and they will basically drop 2 bombs, one at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after the 2 bombs being dropped in September of 1945, exactly 6 years after, on 2nd September 1945, Japan will surrender and the Second World War will be over. This is basically the war for you. I have to discuss anti-Semitism with you. I have to discuss Holocaust with you once I've completed this whole story. Now, can I read this story out from the PPT? But did it make sense? It's a very long story, very, very long story. And generally, there's no way you can write 250 words in all of this. So I'll read it out to you. But as I said, month by month summary, I already have given it to you if you want to read in that sense. So, our Great Depression did not affect USSR much. It did. But these are resource-rich countries. When it comes to Holocaust, I will discuss that is happening in the background. Now, see, opening moves 39-40, defeat of Poland, occupation of Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, France, and then invasion of Egypt and Greece. Then the invasion of Soviet Union will happen, or Barbarossa will happen in June of 1941. Pearl Harbor will happen in December of 1941. Hawaii was an island. It's an island of the coast of USA. Okay. What happened if Hitler had a nuclear bomb? People say that he had or he was developing a nuclear bomb, but he was not having the resources to get the uranium needed for it. He had the technology, but not the uranium. He was very close to it. He had developed a technology, fission he understood. A scientist also understood. Uranium, enriched uranium was not there. Thereafter comes the counteroffensive, which is the Battle of Midway Islands, Battle of Amiens, and Battle of Stalingrad, which will be won by the USSR. Battle of Normandy, 44, the invasion of Germany, and the surrender of Japan. Now, let me read this story out to you. Basically, is in the Pacific. Yes, it's in the Pacific. Hawaii is in the Pacific. Now, the defeat of Poland will be in September of 1939. Poland offered strong resistance, but there was no match to the German blitzkrieg. Polish army had no motorized division. Polish air force was very quickly destroyed. USSR also invaded Poland, so they had double siege itself. And the German air force, the Luftwaffe, destroyed Poland's means of communications. And Britain was faraway island, and France was preparing for war itself. So nobody came to the rescue of Poland. Thereafter, the Germans will start a swift invasion of Holland, Belgium, and France. And by 22nd June, France had surrendered after a quick blitzkrieg into that sector. The Battle of Britain will start in August-September 1940. It's an aerial battle. Luftwaffe will target harbors, radar stations, aerodomes, ammunition factory. However, the Royal Air Force will also give very strong resistance, and the Germans will then call off the Battle of Britain. Thereafter, based on the frustration, they will then go to Africa and Greece. In 1940, Mussolini attacked Egypt through Libya, and Mussolini attacked Greece from Albania. However, in both places, Italy started to get defeated, and Hitler had to send his troops. By May of 1941, Greece and the Egyptian sector was captured. This was seen as a major failure of the Allied powers. Now, after taking this, Operation Barbarossa will start in in 1941, June of 1941. Germany will have a three-pronged attack on USSR. Attack on Leningrad from north, attack on Moscow from center, attack on the southern sector and Ukrainian sector. Stalin was initially surprised. He had ignored American intelligence. And 5.5 million, 5.5 million. Galaxy, I will discuss how USA and USSR, same side, will start to fight. That we will come to, that is Cold War politics. 5.5 million German infantry, 3,550 German tanks, and 5,000 bombers will invade USSR. Important cities like Kiev and Riga will fall quickly. However, Operation Barbarossa was a failure because when it came to Battle of Stalingrad and Moscow, both were defeated because of the following factors. First is that autumnal rain made sure that the roads were muddy, so the attack speed reduced. Then the winters was their first or the most important weapon which they had. Repeated delays meant that they went in the winters. No adequate clothing. Luftwaffe could not be used in minus 38, 40 degrees Celsius. And instead of focusing on Moscow, Hitler tried to take Ukraine for the oil fields. And that, adding to the fact that the Russians absorbed the German attack, burned down all of these cities so that the German forces would not get relief. And the strategy was to wear down the German strength and then attack with force. Now, whilst all of this is happening, now comes the USA Japan thing. Japan saw the British Malaya and Burma and Dutch as an easy target. So they attacked and took the military establishments, which basically all of these countries were busy fighting Germany. This will lead to the USA and the Japanese relationship to become a little bit sour. And Dengel Tojo, who had become the prime minister at this point of time, will have a very aggressive agenda that he wanted to now take the whole of South Asia. So the Japanese will do a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, an American island of Hawaii. 3,700 men will be killed. 350 aircrafts will be destroyed. 5 battleships will be destroyed. USA and Britain now declared war on Japan on 8 December 1941. Japan thereafter still did not stop. It kept on rampaging through this sector till 1942. However, the US had now entered the war, and the tide of the war was now going to turn. Now, the first thing which they do is what we call as the Battle of Midway Islands, in which the USA will defeat the Japanese on the seas, and basically the Japanese will stop trying to attack the US because they had already lost an aircraft carrier, and the US now showed their power. On the other hand, now they will start to concentrate towards Egypt and Greece in what is called Battle of Alamein. Battle of Alamein, German forces were defeated by the English, and thereafter major role played by the air power of the Allies. The Americans were very fresh, and now in order to protect the Suez Canal, they will now go for the next step after liberating this area, which is the invasion of Italy. Now, the fall of Italy will happen in July of 1943. Britain, America will quickly capture Sicily and thereafter trigger a revolution in Italy where the king will remove Mussolini. Later, he will be killed on the streets of Italy. And Germany will attack Italy, take Rome so that the southern front does not come till German borders itself. However, now Italian forces were on the side of the Allies. Then comes the Operation Overlord, 6 June 1944, D-Day as it is called, on the beaches of Normandy. The British, US, and the French forces were dropped off, and now the invasion and the liberation of France had started. Once that was done, invasion of Germany will be planned. The invasion was there was a conference which just happened before the invasion of Germany, which is called the Potsdam Conference. We will discuss it. In this, they had already decided that they will not allow Germany to surrender. They wanted to occupy Germany, unlike the First World War. And they said that we will enter and kill Hitler ourselves. German counteroffensive had limited success in December of 1944. The USSR attacked Germany from the Eastern Front, and Hitler committed suicide. And in May of 1945, Germany surrendered. However, the surrender of Japan was still left. Only the Japanese government refused to do it. The US now had developed, under Manhattan Project and under Oppenheimer, the nuclear bombs. 6th August, US will drop it on Hiroshima. 9th August, they will drop it on Nagasaki. On 15th August, Japanese Emperor Hirohito will announce surrender. And on 2nd September 1945, Japan will surrender on board USS Missouri, and the war was over. Now, if this is clear, I want to give you a break and then come back and discuss why, what, how. Yes? Okay. Anjali, neo-fascist, Meloni, Trump, Putin, whatever you want to say. So we come back at 7. Discuss it, the Axis powers lose. We already know that they had a shortage of raw material. It was a war of production and attrition. Germany would never have won. And thereafter, swift victory was the way only which Germany could have won this war, which became problematic after a certain point. And the long war concept is very, very important. That long war was the solution for Hitler's actions. If you are going to prolong the war, then basically Hitler had no answer to it. As it is by 1942, people have learned or had learned how to basically manage blitzkrieg, and Axis were too dependent on territorial forces. This is a very important point. Armored, armored and infantry divisions. No navy and air force after a point becomes useless. And over and above that, Axis powers took too much upon themselves also, and Hitler was also let down by his allies in that sense. Now, before I talk about the Holocaust, I've given you this in the PPT. These are all the events which I've discussed on one timeline. So if you want, nobody's asking you to learn it. Hitler brutally destroyed London. Yes, London was mostly bombed by Hitler because London comes in the southern sector of England. So very simply, this is the basic stress timeline. However, you don't have to learn it because nobody is asking you to explain these events, but I've still given you this. Now, what I want to discuss is effect and the concept of Holocaust. See, when we talk about the number of people who died, the number of we Anjali, I have to discuss that, but that for that I'll discuss Cold War. So I know what is there in the PPT. Don't worry about that. So 70 to 85 million people were dead, and therefore this war was even more bloodier than the First World War. 2 crore dead in Russia, 60 million in Poland. I'll tell you how. Germans lost 40 lakh. 60 lakh, 40 lakh, 20 lakh Chinese who were killed by the Japanese. Japanese lost 20 lakh. And then 4 lakh 50,000 in Britain and 4 lakh 20,000 in USA. Now, the point is, Russia in both the wars actually lost a lot of men in that sense. But the effect of the war was good for us. The Chinese did not fight in the war. The Chinese defended themselves against the Japanese. That was the aggression of the Japanese in the Chinese sector. So that is Japan trying to invade China. Now, very simply, for us, it was a good thing because it severely weakened the imperial powers. And whilst there was a lot of social change which happened, where there was total social change in Europe, their demography was changed. With the end of this war, Britain, which was the superpower of the world, between 1500 to 1945, Britain was the superpower of the world. And this superpower had now basically lost its control over its own economy. And now it had become severely weakened. And therefore, the position of the superpower was left, which basically links it with the Cold War politics. But for us, it was decolonization. The decolonization, the way the whole of what we call as the third world was created, that in Asia, most of the decolonization happened after the Second World War. And therefore, the global south was created after the Second World War, wherein these powers were not in a position to hold on to their colonies any longer. Now, before I talk about Cold War, which is basically the effect of the war itself, I want to discuss very briefly, because it's not optional level, and as it is, UPSC is not asked a question or not asking a question about you, about that, which is Holocaust, anti-Semitism of Hitler. I've had a discussion, if you've ever been in the webinars with me, I had a discussion when I was discussing Hamas and Israel, but why not here? Now, what is the connection of Jews? I'll tell you. See, try to understand this point, that Hitler had nothing specific with the Jews. Please understand this point. Hitler had nothing specific with the Jews. But in Germany and the German territories, Jews controlled most of the businesses. And in order to give Germans employment, he needed to take away the employment away from Jews. Now the question is, where does the hatred against the Jews come from? And that can be traced to Christianity itself. See, anti-Semitism, which is anti-Semitic languages. Semitic languages is Hebrew, Arabic, and all. Hebrew is the language of the Judaistic or of Judaism, which is Jews. Christianity always had a problematic relationship with the Jews. It is believed that the Jews crucified the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and therefore there's always a conflict between Christianity and Jews. And it's not that there was no conflict. For centuries, Christians had been discriminating against the Jews, but the anti-Semitism which existed before Hitler was based on social discrimination. That is, discriminate against the Jews, and by discriminating against the Jews, what you are doing is that you are just giving them second-class citizen. You are making them work. In Egypt, they were laborers. The Jews have suffered quite a lot throughout their history. Therein comes the aggression of Israel in that sense. But the point is, social discrimination was the solution which Christianity gave to Jews. So Hitler's hatred towards the Jews comes from his own religion, which is Christianity. On the other hand, he had to find the Jews in such a way that he needed to take away the employment from the Jews so as to give it to the Germans. And that was something very important. That was something very, very important as an agenda of Hitler, that every German will have a employment, certain income, and he had promised everybody full employment. Now, Hitler, in order to target the Jews now, he will change anti-Semitism and add race into it and add what is called the concept of scientific anti-Semitism. I'm telling you, anti-Semitism. Why Christians hate Jews? Because it is believed that Jesus Christ was crucified by the Jews. That is their understanding. I'm not here to discuss the theology of Christianity and Judaism, but it is believed that their Lord and Savior was targeted by the Jews. So again, Karuka, Pratik, I'm answering you that Christianity, these Abrahamic religions have issues generally because of having the same space and being competing with each other. But Judaism and Christianity are even more closer when it comes to conflict because of this connection. So very simply, anti-Semitism is inbuilt into Christianity. But Hitler now starts to discuss about the concept of race and scientific anti-Semitism. He argues that what Germany represents is the Aryan race. Now, if you've done ancient medieval art and culture with me, or you basically have an idea, Aryan is not a racial concept. Aryan is a linguistic concept. Multiple races used to speak the same Indo-European language, which makes it an ethnicity rather than a racial concept. And Aryan people were multiple races speaking the same language. And therefore, he started to argue that no, Aryans are not linguistic people. Aryans are what Germans look like. Tall, blonde, blue-eyed, very, very strongly built. And the Aryan race concept now was used to exclude the Jews, that the Jews are not Germans, they are separate to our identity. And he will then appropriate one of the Christian symbols. This is not the swastika. Swastika has dots in it. This is called the crooked cross. It's again a Christian symbol. He takes this symbol and now makes it his party symbol. But the most important point is the solution which Hitler gave to the Jewish issue. His his answer to the Jewish problem which Christianity had created was extermination. That the only way we can actually take revenge for our own religious understanding is by killing all Jews. Again, there is an agenda behind it. Hitler has nothing against the Jews specifically. It's his Christian belief and his agenda of the Nazi party and his racial understanding that the Jews don't fit in the German nation itself. And therefore, the Jews will be pushed into concentration camps, and in these concentration camps they will be gassed to death, and close to 60 to 80 6 to 8 million Jews were killed all across Europe in 8 to 9 concentration camps. And that is what is called as Holocaust. Abrahamic religion would be Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So very simply, Holocaust is the systematic killing of Jews across Europe by the Nazi party and the Nazi army, Hitler. And this is one of the biggest blot on Hitler's, what we call as a portfolio, if you want to say. And Hitler did not embody, he was not the first to say that the Jews need to be punished, but his solution was not social discrimination, but was that Jews are greedy, Jews are the one who betrayed it. He also linked up Judaism with Bolshevism. He said all Jews are Bolshevik and all Bolsheviks are Jews, which is technically not true, but his propaganda was strong. And therefore, he will start to kill the Jews. He also killed disabled people. He said that disabled people should not procreate, they should not reproduce because they are not German. He killed any German who was very dark skinned. Basically, that is why today you will see all Germans look the same, be it man or woman. They are very similar looking because their genetic profile was very cleansed by Hitler itself. He did not allow anybody who did not fit his understanding of Aryan to actually even procreate. So where is the symbol? This is the symbol. This is a crooked cross. This is already there in Christianity. So very simply, Hitler had such big power over the Germans that Germans were ready to exterminate a whole religion because they thought that that was what the nation needed. So please, straightforward, nobody's doing a thesis here. Holocaust, killing of Jews, anti-Semitism inbuilt into Christianity. Scientific anti-Semitism is what he develops, kills all the Jews, and in the name of the Aryan race. Aryan concept was modified to make it a race concept, and anybody who did not fit his image of a German was not allowed to procreate and was killed in the eventual form of cleansing of the German society. Right? Okay. This is not social engineering. This is ethnic cleansing. Yes, the Holocaust is a systematic extermination of Jews. Okay. Yes, they were doing gross experiments also on. They were used to do basic human experiments on the Jews. That what is basically that proved to the people that scientifically a Jew is different. So they have long noses, they are greedy, they have this gene which is basically making them betrayers of the German society. All this literature was created. You call it a genocide, sure. Why did the US started laying stress on decolonization? I'll tell you that. Can I now move to Cold War politics? Germans are not Aryans. German people initially were Aryan speaking. Please understand this point. Aryan is not a race, it's an ethnicity. German language is actually comes from the family of languages which is called Indo-European. When we'll do ancient medieval, you will realize it. I'll discuss it when we do Vedic age. Okay. Hitler targeted Jews for two reasons. One, inbuilt hatred which comes from Christianity. Second, because Jews controlled all the businesses. He wanted to take away employment from them. He needed to basically create us versus them. He needed a us and he needed them. Them were the Jews. Okay. Why Britain was so Jew friendly? Why you should not? It's not about Jew friendly. It's about humanity. So very simply, Jewish people controlled businesses. A lot of industrialists in Britain and in America also. The second largest population of Jews is actually in America. They are the industrialists. So why would not Britain be pro-industrialist, pro-Jew? Okay. Modern Indian history, Indians saw socialism of Russia able to stand against Great Depression where... No, that is technically not true. Tiduri, not true. Not true. Great Depression handling of USSR was not very good, and Stalin basically had what we call as collectivization. He killed a lot of people in the process of doing that. Socialism in Russia was also a sham. It was never proper socialism. Can we go forward? Why is USA in favor of Israel? Jewish connection, lot of money. Every producer in the Hollywood is a Jew. Lot of money has been pushed into the American economy by Jews. Okay. Now, this is the discussion which really matters to us, which is, yes, they are a very, very wealthy class. It's called the Cold War. Now, the question is, if America would not have dropped the 2 atomic bombs, would the Japanese had surrendered? The answer is yes. The answer is not no. It's yes. It would have taken time, but if not September, December, eventually the Japanese would have surrendered. The point is that dropping 2 nuclear bombs was overkill, was literal overkill. See, Germany had surrendered, Italy had surrendered, Japan would have surrendered either way, because Japan sure is an industrial power, but if America, Britain and France and even USSR would have come together to fight with the Japanese, now I ask you again, would the Japanese would have survived it? You tell me. Would the Japanese would have survived a simple, straightforward frontal attack by everybody? That's true. No. So then the question is, why was the bomb dropped? The question is, why was then the bomb dropped? Because the bomb was not needed. And the reason is that even before the war was over, the age-old question was back. Basically, the bomb was dropped to send a message to the USSR that we have a nuclear bomb. And between 1945 and 49, America was the only power to have a bomb. See, if you remember, I told you that Hitler and Mussolini were basically recruited by the capitalists to protect their interest. The question was still, who will counter socialism? And the answer to that question was Hitler and Mussolini. They will counter socialism. But these two fools went too beyond protecting capitalism to become dictators who wanted to capture Europe. Now, as soon as Germany is dead, Italy is dead. Now the question was, now USSR and Stalin wanted their place in history. Britain was in now no position to be a superpower. It could not be hegemonic. It could not be the power which dominates everyone. As it is, India was now becoming a major problem for Britain itself. And as it is, there was no way Europe was going to hold Asia now. So the question was, Stalin still had the capacity to argue that I am the single-handed reason why the Nazi party was defeated, the Nazi army was defeated across Europe. I have sacrificed my men to make sure that Europe is protected. So my place in history should be complete. My place in history should be complete. My place in history should be right where it should be, wherein I should be the one who dominates Europe now. However, that was not acceptable to the capitalist powers, because that means socialism is going to dominate. So the age-old question is back. So now USA will stand up and say that I will be the vanguard of or the protector of capitalism. And one of you asked me that why did America be so adamant in decolonization? Because obviously USA wanted Britain to fully lose power. So the American pressure was to basically remove Britain and France from the picture and make it into a bipolar world in which two powers are competing for the superpower tag. So very simply, Stalin wanted his place in history, while on the other hand, capitalism wanted its protector, the US. So the point is that by May of 1945, everybody knew that the war is going to be over. But now everybody was also fearing that USSR is going to now dominate. So Cold War politics is which dominated the world between 1945 to 1992. This world, this period is where both these powers are competing to be the next superpower who will dominate the world. However, it is called Cold War because now that the nuclear power had been unleashed, nobody wanted frontal warfare. Nobody wanted frontal warfare. That is direct warfare. So what Cold War is basically is proxy war. Diplomatic war, spying on each other, creating pressure, economic sanctions. It's about creating indirect sources of pressure on that country. Trade, diplomacy, espionage, spying, the concept of diplomatic tussles. However, the Cold War did manifest itself in three places. One, Korea. Second, in Afghanistan. And third, in Vietnam. Vietnam we will discuss on Monday. Afghanistan you had already done, I think. When you would have done international relations, Afghanistan would have been done previously. Korea, I will tell you what the basic story is. What is the basic story of Korea? Now, before I go into Cold War politics, Israel-Palestine has nothing to do with Cold War politics. Before I go into Cold War politics, I will discuss what about Cuban Missile Crisis. That is not war. I will discuss Berlin blockade, Berlin Wall, and Cuban Missile Crisis. Separate issue altogether. They're called escalation points. We are discussing proper warfare. Now, please, first, before we go into Cold War politics, in a way, World War I, interwar, World War II, cause significance. All of that is clear. Korea means Korea. South and North Korea was created because of Cold War politics. Yes? Why Britain sidelined from Cold War politics? That is standard geopolitics. Why do you want an old colonial power to fight against? Capitalism only needs one protector, not two. USSR is socialism's protector. So why would USA want Britain to be there? Somehow you are becoming sympathetic with the British. Not a good feeling. Not a good thing. They are what they are. The US wanted to remove the British from the picture. No, it's not that the UN was the reason why Cold War was the only way. UN is still was totally a useless organization. That point also, till today, it is a useless organization. UN has no standing other than just being used by the P5 to push their own agenda. Okay. Yes, Anshu. Okay. Now, can we discuss Cold War and what is its basic manifestations? I want everybody's assertion here, because now we move transition into this period. In this, you will get three type of questions which I will tell you, and UPSC is not asked a question till this point from this area generally. Okay. Now, in Cold War politics, there are two phases, and I will say three phases. 1945 to 1954. 54 is when Stalin dies. Then 1954 to 1962, and from 1962 to 1991. In this period, there are multiple events which happened, in which you have to study Berlin blockade, you have to discuss USSR nuclear test, formation of NATO. In the second phase, this is the phase which is the most explosive phase. You have Berlin Wall crisis. Warsaw Pact happens in the second phase, but doesn't really matter to us. Warsaw Pact, I will tell you, but it is there. Formation of NATO is more significant than Warsaw. Then Berlin Wall crisis, I'm telling you the important events which you need to know. And Cuban Missile Crisis. And this period is called détente, which is called de-escalation. De-escalation. In this period, the Cold War will ease, and in this, the two most significant events will be what we call as Berlin Wall demolition, rather we'll say unification of Germany, East and West, and disintegration of USSR. We have to discuss what is the basic. Any treaty after World War II? No. There are conferences, but no treaties. No Treaty of Versailles. Should the European change their mentality? Sure. Europe's problem is not world's problem. That has always been the fact. You're quoting the foreign minister. That is true. That is true. It's not a war of ideologies. It's a war of two systems. It's not a war of ideologies, war of systems. Can I now go into these phases, the three phases? Okay. Now, see, even before, I'll just read this out to you, what is Cold War, so that you are clear about that. What is Cold War is two superpowers, USA and USSR, remaining in rivalry, who fought for ideological supremacy and influence. Instead of engaging in open conflict, these two powers engaged in proxy war. There was political distress, diplomatic maneuvering, economic sanctions, propaganda, military competition, espionage, which is spying, psychological warfare, and bitter relations. Every act was suspicious, and these things complicated the way diplomacy was done across the world. Now, even before the war was over, the Cold War politics was on. See, at the Yalta conference, when in February of 1945, just before the invasion of Germany, Roosevelt, the US, Churchill, and Stalin Churchill UK, Stalin USSR. They met and this is the conception of the Bretton Woods twins, which is basically the UN, not the Bretton Woods twins, but the UN, which is that the United Nations organizations will be created after the war is over. So the inception of the UN is at the Yalta conference itself. They were also thinking that there is no need to give Germany the chance to surrender. We will occupy Germany and then we'll see what to do with it. So from the east, Germany is going to, from the east, USSR is going to come. From the west, the American and the British and the French will come. And at this point of time, this Yalta conference was considered a very important success because everybody was in agreement with what is going to happen. However, thereafter, Stalin saw something which started to change his opinion. So when it came to the invasion of Germany in 1945 itself, the Allies, specifically Britain, France, and the US, delayed the invasion without telling USSR. Because they wanted USSR to go first, and the Germans would then weaken the USSR, and then they would enter from the west. So while Russia invaded in February, they invaded only in March. And here Stalin could see that these powers, these capitalist powers, are doing a discriminatory strategy, bhedbhav, with USSR. So the Allies were deliberately delaying the attack so that the Russian cost increases. So Russia could feel that it was something that old socialistic capitalistic competition is back. But the real division between these two factions happens at the Potsdam Conference. Potsdam Conference, now Roosevelt has been replaced by Truman, who's now the president, and the one who gave us independence, Churchill, is replaced by Attlee, Clement Attlee. Attlee and Truman don't trust Stalin. So when they invaded Germany, now Truman and Attlee said to Stalin that you withdraw to your original border, we will take over Germany and figure out what to do with it. But Stalin said no. Now there's a disagreement between them, and the German sector gets divided, as you can see in front of you, into two parts. One will be called West Germany, and the other one will be called East Germany. It will be called West Germany under the capitalist powers, and will be East Germany. And because they had also landed in the Berlin sector, Berlin, which is basically the capital of Germany, also got divided into two parts. One part was West Berlin. This was the capitalist part. And then on the other hand, you had the USSR held East Germany, East Berlin. But you can see that Berlin is in the heart of East Germany itself. But now they do not want Germany to be left alone. And this is the beginning of the occupation of Germany by these powers. But here the disagreements have already started to develop. And what happened was that West Germany got recognized by everybody, but East Germany wasn't. And once this is going to happen, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki is going to happen, now Stalin will basically say, I have to assert my identity, and by hook and crook, by assassination, by bribing, USSR will take Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Albanian sector. These are called the satellite states. So this is the main USSR. And now Stalin, after looking at the way the West was actually acting in front of him, In order to invade Germany, he had to enter into these countries. But once he enters into these countries, he does not go back. So Poland, East Germany, rather Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were called the satellite states of USSR. These countries had not chosen to be part of the USSR, but they were added into the USSR by installing what we call as a fake regime there. And now a word emerged which Churchill used and is relevant even today. And that word is that he argued that across Europe, an iron curtain has befallen. That basically this half will be called the Eastern Bloc and this half will be called the Western Bloc. The world which is capitalistic and which is socialist. This is the word which has recently been used also with regards to Ukraine crisis, which is the Iron Curtain has shifted. The Iron Curtain has shifted. This is the Iron Curtain which basically people talk about. That how USSR in a way illegally invaded these countries, installed Soviet regimes and argued that they were part of the USSR. Now, if I was the West, would I want this Iron Curtain to move a step further? Yeah, most of the Balkan region with the USSR, yes. Except for Yugoslavia, which went into NAM. You know, India, NAM, Yugoslavia, NAM. So, very simply, the West now fears socialism. The West fears socialism. And this Iron Curtain was now going to be a reality which will exist for a very long time in Europe. And people tended to argue that in a way USSR deserved certain territory because for what it did for the Europeans when it came to the Nazi party and against Hitler. But still, the concept is that Stalin now started to use force, which was basically not justified. So while people accepted the fact that Russia should have a sphere of influence, it was the way it did it is the problem. Now, I have established to you the geography of the Cold War. I've discussed the basic ideology behind the Cold War. Now, can I discuss the events of the Cold War? Austria is non-aligned. Sure. Perfect. Okay. Now, the first thing which I want to discuss is called the Berlin blockade. Now see, pay attention. These people have if this was Germany, they have occupied West Germany and East Germany. But the more interesting story here is how Berlin was divided. East Berlin and West Berlin. Who was controlling Balkan? More or less USSR. Now, Stalin was annoyed by two very major things. Firstly, all the Western countries came together and they said that we recognize the West Germany. So the Western Bloc recognized the West German sector, but they did not recognize East Germany. So Stalin didn't like the fact that he was the one who was not recognized. And then came a doctrine which is called the Truman Doctrine. From the Americans. From the Americans. And the Truman Doctrine was what? Was that the Americans will not go back into isolationism, which it did after First World War. Rather, it will protect the people who are under distress and are occupied by people who are armed. Basically, it's a jab on the USSR that the American is ready to fight, or the Americans are ready to fight the Russians. And based on the Truman Doctrine, his Secretary of State was a person called George Marshall. A plan was created which is called the Marshall Plan. And under the Marshall Plan, it's an economic plan. It's an economic manifestation of the political Truman Doctrine. Marshall Plan was very simple. Take as much money as possible from the Americans, but do not go towards socialism. You want money? We will shove money down your throat. We will give you technology. We will give you infrastructure. We will reconstruct the whole of Europe. We will do anything and everything. You just don't become socialist. So basically, America started to develop West Germany like a capitalistic, very beautiful cities used to come up. And West Berlin also used to look like a totally different state itself. On the other hand, the purpose for which Stalin was holding Germany or the satellite states was not to prove that USSR was better, was to exploit these areas. And herein, basically, Stalin already had lost the Cold War because USA wanted to prove to the world that capitalism works. Capitalism works. Capitalism brings in modernization. Capitalism brings in better standard of living. Capitalism is the better system. But this is not what Stalin wanted to do. Stalin rather wanted to exploit these territories for what they had lost during the war. And therefore, Stalin already had lost the ideological battle. He did not want to prove that socialism is better. No. He wanted to have USSR's place in history, and he wanted to exploit these areas. This differentiation is major. Understand this point, that this differentiation is major. And even before the Cold War started, the war was already over. Because America was there to prove a point. Think of America like India and think of USSR like Pakistan. From the get-go itself, Pakistan had lost the point of why a nation needs to be created, and India had understood why India matters. Same way USSR did not understand why they are in this, and the Americans wanted to show to the world capitalism is a better mode of production than socialism. Now, all of this will annoy Stalin quite a lot. So when the Truman Doctrine did come through, the US President Truman in 1947 said that the US would support peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This doctrine also, in a way, paved the way for the British coming under more pressure also, because this applies to colonies also. And in that way, USA has now argued two things. It will not return to isolation as it did in First World War. It was now going to contain communism as much as possible. It will stop socialism from spreading. And based on this doctrine, we have the Marshall Plan, which said that European recovery program will be ours. We offer economic and financial help to whosoever needs it. Now, if I'm Stalin, will I be very, very happy with all of these things? No, obviously. And in that frustration, he had already entered into the Eastern European sector with expanding communism. Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, all go under USSR because of either party fund fraud, assassination, intimidation, direct interference. They did something for sure. All this was done by the secret police and the KGB, and Stalin was getting more and more annoyed. And now will come the first major escalation, which is called the Berlin blockade of 1948. Can I discuss now the Berlin blockade? The background to the Berlin blockade is done. There is no recognition to West Germany. The Truman Doctrine is now there, and there is also rising tension between the USSR and the USA. Now, please pay attention. As soon as Truman Doctrine is that the USA will counter communism. That is the Truman Doctrine. Now, as soon as who rules Germany? Western Germany is ruled by the US, and the government there is recognized by the US. A democratic government has been established in Western Germany. In Eastern Germany also, there is a USSR appointed government. And the same will be true for East and West Berlin. USSR and USA appointed mayors were there. Now, Stalin, as soon as Western Germany was not recognized, Stalin was not very amused. So if you look at it, Berlin should be in East Germany, whole of it, because it is in the heart of East Germany. If you go by the understanding of geography, why is that within the East German sector, you have such a big sector which is the West Berlin sector? So when the Americans, the French and the British don't recognize East Berlin, or rather they don't recognize East Germany, now Stalin comes up with a plan, what is called the Berlin blockade, to get whole of Berlin. His idea was very simple, that there were rail links between these two sectors. Trains used to travel through this sector, and there was one road which used to go till, or used to connect the Western Germany with West Berlin, with West Berlin. Now, the plan for Stalin was, in retaliation, he blocked all of these three rail and road links. And his understanding was that I will suffocate the West Berlin sector so much that they would automatically give up on the Berlin sector itself. Once the people will basically get frustrated will die of hunger, they will automatically leave this area. So the Berlin blockade was basically suffocate or cut off Western Berlin from Western Germany. But what did Stalin forget? What did Stalin forget? Come on. A very obvious thing. Yes, very good. Very obvious thing Stalin forgot, which is that there's something called aeroplane. There's something called aeroplane. And very simply, the Berlin blockade was countered by the Western powers airlifting every resource to West Berlin. And this is called the Berlin airlift. Now the point is that if Stalin touches these these aircrafts, it's an act of war. It's an act of war. If he touches any of these aircrafts, It's an act of war because there's American or British aircrafts. So now what the purpose of Berlin blockade was to suffocate the Germans in the West Berlin sector. Now that has been undercut by the Berlin airlift. And this will frustrate Stalin even more because now the Berlin blockade is useless. So he will start it in 1948 and we call it by early 1949. So the Berlin blockade, the first moment in the Cold War, was an outright victory for the Western powers, and Stalin was not able to assert what he wanted to assert. However, the Berlin blockade creates a very dangerous thing. See, 1948, West Berlin is now like a capitalist island in the middle of a communist East Germany. Stalin wanted or was concerned about Germany joining the Western Bloc and loss of communist state itself. Russia immediately suspended all road, rail, and canal links with West Berlin and West Germany. The response was the Berlin airlift, where the Western powers now started to bring everything to the starving population through supplies. However, the West started airlifting the supplies in the West Berlin. Russia was helpless and they had to then, in a way, early 1949, they had to call off the Berlin blockade. Now, can I discuss what happened after this? Because that is the most interesting thing. Berlin blockade is a failure. Can we discuss what happened after this? But the question is why Germany was divided, because nobody, unlike the first World War, Germany was given the chance to go for ceasefire and remained one unit. But the consequence was the rise of Hitler. So they did not want to basically leave it to chance. And everybody wanted that they occupy Germany. And the understanding was that all of these four powers would come into consensus, transfer power and then leave. But when they went into disagreement amongst themselves, that in turn will lead to the occupation of Germany by these two parts in that sense. So Berlin blockade, as I said, very simply, is Stalin trying to take East Berlin by rather Stalin trying to take West Berlin by suffocating it, blocking all roads and rail, and the Americans starting to airlift everything to undercut it. Now the question is that what is the consequence of this? What is the consequence of this? Berlin blockade is a failure. Now, the consequence of this is something which the Americans not going to isolation means that after First World War, they went back to isolation, did not be active part of world politics. Here they want to be. Berlin blockade is a failure. And the answer to this from Stalin is going to be something which the USA never thought about, which is the USSR will test its first nuclear bomb. In 1949. They will become a proper nuclear power by 1953, because that is the last test. But the USSR will conduct their first nuclear bomb test. Till this point, the USA had a deterrence, had the upper hand, because it had the nuclear bomb. But the USSR has now developed, yes, after the Berlin blockade was a failure, in late, this is by May of 1949. By the June-July, Stalin responds by the USSR testing its first nuclear bomb. And this will basically send a panic throughout the Western Bloc. This will send a panic throughout the Western Bloc that this was an unprecedented response to something which they had not thought will go out of hand like this. Because the USA said that the technology was secure, But we know that the USSR had already sent a spy in the form of a British scientist. And very simply, that British scientist was noting down what Oppenheimer was doing. And he was basically a KGB agent who will later take all this material to the USSR and later allow them to develop within 4 years of the Americans a nuclear bomb. And with the Americans now having with the Russians having a nuclear bomb, now the Iron Curtain became real and the Western Bloc was in panic. And it is in this context that in 1949, NATO will be formed. Because now the West feared that a nuclear attack had become imminent. So what will happen is that their first form will be called the Brussels Defense Treaty. The Brussels Defense Treaty. But then America, Canada will join it, and it will be renamed as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the NATO will be a turning point in the history of the world, because it till today exists, and it has two very important principles. The first principle of NATO is an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all of them, which is the concept of collective security. And second principle is the concept of how there has to be a joint command, which is that all of them bring in their armies, and there will be a NATO army, air force and navy. So the NATO was formed in a context wherein the West became extremely nervous of USSR's action. So Britain, France, Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg went into what is called the Brussels Defense Treaty. But when the Americans and the Canada joined it in April of 1949, that will in turn lead to what we call as the formation of the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the first principle of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a response to the what we call as the USSR test, is that an attack on any one of them is an attack on all. And the countries will place their defense forces under a joint NATO command for coordinated attack. NATO, therefore, will become, until today, is the staple for Western cooperation when it comes to military response. But for a country like India, NATO is useless, because we can't take decisions by asking Americans for everything. Because NATO is dominated by, and still is dominated by, the Americans. No, it's not that we are not Western. We have been offered entry into the NATO multiple times. But the point is, it has no purpose to us, because NATO joint command is the problem. We can't place the Indian Army, Air Force under the NATO command. Then if it is coming to Pakistan and any incursion from the Chinese, first we'll go and plead to the US that give us our own army. That is not the way we work. We need to have our own sovereignty. We need to have our own army, air force and navy to protect ourselves. It's a military organization. It's a military organization. It's a strategic military defense partnership. The entire army gets that mandate. Yes, Sachin, as a NATO nation, you cannot act without the NATO telling you what to act on. So the point is, if there is something which has to be done, NATO will take it as a joint decision. Now, the formation of the NATO, in a way, shows that the West is coming together. Everybody is with me till this point. All of this you've done in what we call as IR also, but I'm giving you context now. This is the historical background on which all of this is happening. Now, NATO has been created, but Stalin will be on his deathbed in a way by 1950, 51, 52. But the Western powers, what they will do is that in 1953, what they will do is that they'll add West Berlin into the NATO. So what the West has done is add West Germany and West Berlin into the NATO by 1953-54. Now, if I'm Russia, would I like this? If I am Russia, would I like this, that the divided part of Germany has now become a part of NATO? So if something happens, it is an attack on NATO countries. So in response to this action, as one of you said, the USSR will come up with what is called the Warsaw Pact. See, Warsaw Pact is exactly like NATO. It is USSR plus all its satellite states, which is Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and more importantly, East Germany. And there was only one principle here, which was attack on one was attack on all. They didn't want a joint command because they did not want to give Poland and Bulgaria too much power. But basically, the Warsaw was nothing but a exact replication of the NATO model, but from the USSR. So you can see that just before Stalin dying, the politics is becoming complicated. So before we go into the most explosive phase of the Cold War, we have discussed Berlin blockade, we've discussed the concept of Berlin airlift, we've discussed formation of NATO, we've discussed the nuclear test. Anybody has any issue in these 4 points? Any issue in these 4 points? No issue. Now, whilst all of this is happening, Korea now becomes center stage. Korea, as you know, was Japan occupied. Was occupied by Japan. And Korea has on this border China and USSR. And in the Philippines sector and in the south, they have the USA. Now the Koreans, they get independence from the Japanese. However, as soon as they become independent from the Japanese, in the north, there emerges a state which was installed by the USSR in Pyongyang. And this state was a communist state, arguing that we are the ones who represent the Koreans. However, as soon as a communist state emerges in the north of Korea, the Americans install in Seoul a capitalist state. And basically, now the north and the south will fight. North Korea and South Korea will fight for whose government is the real one. Whose government is the real one. And this is basically the genesis of North Korea, South Korea issue, which basically there has been no ceasefire. There has only been one agreement through which they stopped the war. There's been no treaty. This war is still ongoing. But this Korean War basically is an example of how Cold War politics played out in countries. This is basically USA versus USSR, but now has taken a form of a war which has happened in Korea. They're not fighting in Europe now, they're fighting in Asia. And the Korean Wars, therefore, was actually the way the Cold War manifested itself on the ground. Can anybody tell me what is the latitude which divides North Korea, South Korea? The line, the latitude, which is basically seen as the division. Come on. Come on, come on, come on. Come on. Not 10th, not 11th, not 13th. I'm looking for the exact number. Come on. You are, yes, not 39th, 38th parallel. Some of you are right totally. Purva, Fani, Madhumita, Sanskar, Prince, Tagdish, Sachin, Vanshi. So 30th parallel. This is basically the latitude along which North and South Korea are divided. Yes, most probably if there was no Cold War politics, Korea would not have divided. Not got divided. It is literally the USSR and the US installing two powers and making them fight. So in this first phase, as you can see, there is a physical manifestation in the form of the Korean wars, and there's all this confusion which is happening. Now I want to go into the second phase, which is the most dangerous phase out of this, which is the period between 1954 and 1962. Can we discuss the events here? Can we discuss the event here? Proxy war was happening in Europe, but this is a physical warfare which is happening. Why Japan supported Russia in Korean War? Japan supported no one. Japan withdrew. Then after that, the USSR automatically installed it. The 1954, what was the next event in Korea? Nothing. North-South got divided. They have fought a war. After that, they signed an armistice. There has been no treaty, no agreement properly. The border still exists. North Korea has now become an old-style USSR-type dictatorship, a reminiscence of the Cold War politics. And South Korea has become what America wanted to show, an example of what capitalism can do. Now, 1954-62 is a very explosive phase because Stalin is dead. And the person who replaces Stalin is a person called Khrushchev. Is a person called Khrushchev. Khrushchev, premier of the US, the USSR premier called Khrushchev. He was as aggressive as Stalin, but Stalin was a totalitarian dictator. So after his death, the very disturbing facts about Stalin start to also come into the world news, wherein he was no less than Hitler, wherein he killed most of his opposition in the name of collectivization, which is in the name of socialist farming. He destroyed agriculture in USSR. There was a great famine in which close to 1 crore people died because of that form of collectivization. He was a dictator. So now the image of the USSR becomes a little bit problematic. But in this period, the first issue happens, and that is called the Berlin Wall crisis in 1961. Now, what happens is that in 1961, both these countries used to spy against each other. Both these countries used to spy against each other. They were trying to go to space also. Russia sent in Sputnik, first satellite to enter into orbit of the Earth also. But 1961, the way imagery was done was not through satellite imagery. There was something called the U-2 planes. And the task of the U-2 plane was very simple, straightforward. These planes, what they had was that these planes were very light and very fast. But in their belly, they used to have very big 3 cameras. And what used to happen was that they used to fly over the Russian territory at very high speed whilst clicking pictures of the landscape. So the U-2 plane basically is the way a satellite imagery was done. Pictures were taken over a period of time to see what is the change in the positions of the USSR. Now, this is all being done as an illegal form of international activity. And in 1961, what will happen is that the USSR will hit one of these U-2 planes. And this U-2 plane will then crash in USSR. And now USSR had a proof that the Americans were spying on them. Everybody was doing it, but now they have physical proof of it. Physical proof of it. And now Khrushchev says to JF Kennedy, Kennedy being the president of USA, apologize. You have to apologize. Until and unless you do not apologize, we will not let the pilot leave. Over and above that, we will make it into an international issue. This means war. Apologize. So the first explosive moment is that now the Americans and the US are on a standoff. Now what happens is that now that the people think that the Third World War is becoming imminent, something embarrassing starts to happen in Germany. People from the West Berlin, from the East German sector and East Berlin sector now start to move into the American zones. Basically, they were choosing the side on the war. They thought that if the Americans and the Russians are going to go to war over the U-2 plane issue, we would like to be on the American side. So is this an embarrassing humiliation for the USSR? That people in huge numbers started to flee to the American zones. And this was something which the USSR needed to stop in order to stop this embarrassment. And in response to this, they will develop a wall which is today called the Berlin Wall. This wall was to stop any movement outside of East Berlin. And this is how the Berlin Wall actually came into existence. Once the Russians made it, a parallel wall was developed by the Americans. The two walls now represented the difference between the two worlds. And the people who are in East Berlin were stuck because even though the USSR was losing this ideological battle, it would not let you go to the American side. If people tried to cross over, you were shot. The people would be shot. So the U-2 plane issue was the reason why the way Americans were under pressure to do something about the U-2 plane being caught. In 61, Khrushchev will say to Kennedy, withdraw from basically to withdraw from Western powers from Berlin also, and also to apologize about what happened. They said that give us Berlin, that is what we want. People started escaping from East Germany to West Berlin. This was a USSR embarrassment. When USA will refuse, USSR will erect the Berlin Wall to block the escape route. So very simply, this is the first major crisis in which the world came close to the Third World War. And a lot of you are talking about Berlin Wall. Now do you get it? What is the context of the Berlin Wall? Because if you understand this, I want to move to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yes, sir. Okay. Now let's go to Cuba or Cuba. Now Cuba is a small island nation here. You can see here, small island nation. And from Florida, it is just 100 to 200 kilometers, maximum. From certain parts of Cuba, you can also see Florida, which is America. Now, Cuba was under a dictator. His name was Batista. And basically, Batista was a CIA and US agent. That whatever he was doing in Cuba, he was doing it in the influence of the Central Intelligence Agency of the US CIA, and he was doing allowing USA to exploit Cuba for its own purpose. Now, this meant that the people of Cuba were very, very angry. Were very, very angry. And there rises a person called Fidel Castro, a communist, who says that Batista is nothing but a US agent. I want Cuba's resources to be used for Cuba itself. And what will happen is that in 1960-61, Fidel Castro will overthrow Batista. And now Cuba became a communist country. Now try to understand what will go through the Americans' mind. Unpe kya beetegi? Because all that that Iron Curtain, that all communism was close to 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers away from them. So it was like it is something which is there, but it is across the continent. But now there is one small communist country. Socialism has now come to the doorstep. It is now at the doorstep. And the Americans now lose it, because if Cuba becomes communist, then socialism exists next to US itself. So the Americans, what they will do is that they will stop all diplomatic relationship, all foreign policy removed, all import-export was banned. But the Americans still wanted to take back Cuba, and therefore in 1961, in what we call as the Bay of Pigs incident, Kennedy is going to sanction what is called an invasion of Cuba, wherein Batista and his supporters along with the CIA will try to reach the Bay of Pigs and then enter Cuba and kill Fidel Castro. Now, USSR, on the other hand, could see that Cuba has become communist. So even before the Bay of Pigs incident happened, USSR had given intelligence to Fidel Castro that the USA is going to do it. So Castro was able to evade this attack, but now he became anti-US and was convinced that the USSR was his brother. Now, in the same period, the USA will install in Turkey what are called the Jupiter and Neptune missiles. So Jupiter and Neptune missiles are basically nuclear capable ballistic missiles. And now they've installed it in Turkey. Turkey is just next to USSR. So the USSR feels threatened that nuclear capable missiles are sitting in Asia. So now the USSR comes up with a plan. The plan is that USSR talks to Castro and says, do you hate US? Castro says, yes, I hate US. So let's do one thing. Let me make a small airport for you in which we can have the MiG-28 land, which is a nuclear capable fighter jet. It can have missiles which are nuclear capable. And you start the digging of silos. Silos are big rocket launching pads which are underground. You begin the digging of these silos. I am sending 4 to 5 ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, and you install it in Cuba. You install it in Cuba. So basically, the USSR convinced Cuba of having a MiG-28 aircraft-based nuclear base and 4 to 5 ballistic missile silos which were capable of launching any missile which could hit as far as Canada. Now the Americans will basically totally lose it. Because if nuclear missiles are sitting in Cuba, no major city in the American sector is basically free or not safe from a nuclear attack. Now, at this point of time, the US will criticize Cuba quite a lot. The UN will be used by the US quite a lot to increase economic sanctions. But Cuba was not ready to give up. Now, what was going to happen was that there was a consignment of ships. There was a consignment of ships which were going to deliver these ballistic missiles. And America said that nobody apologized to USSR. Nobody apologized to USSR. America said that we are creating a blockade around Cuba. If USSR tries to enter into Cuban waters, we will shoot down these ships. And USSR said that you can't do it in international waters. International waters is nobody's space, and Cuban waters is Cuban's water. You can't do anything. Now, what happens is there's a standoff. These ships remain 5 to 50, right, close to 20 to 30 nautical miles away from Cuba, and America is ready to shoot them down if they move further. At this point of time, everybody thought that America or the USSR are going to do something, and the Third World War will start, which will be a nuclear war. Now this is a proper standoff. The world had never been so nervous, and people thought that the US will not give up. But because it was in the interest of the US to not allow Cuba to have these missiles, Kennedy is going to offer something to the USSR. USA will say that we are ready to remove our Jupiter and Neptune missiles from the Turkish sector. In return, you don't install these missiles in Cuba. We are ready to give up our nuclear base in Gorbachev is late, Shreyank. We will give up our base in Turkey. You don't install these missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev, therefore, knowing that there was no better alternative way, both will accept each other and stand down. And this was the last time when the world came very close to a nuclear war happening and the Third World War happening. For us, it seems to be just one standoff. Imagine what would be going through the world press, the world people, and the population at this point of time, the level of distress and the level of nervousness which everybody would have had when we know that the Cuban Missile Crisis or the standoff is happening. The Americans showed a lot of maturity here because they knew that nuclear warfare takes nobody nowhere. And ironically, the most destructive bomb in the world was also the biggest deterrence in this world. It was a symbol of peace in a way, that because people knew that the war is going to be nuclear, nobody wanted to fight a war. Clear? Cuban Missile Crisis. Because then we go into détente. Anybody, any issue? Cuban Missile Crisis? Clear? What these circles indicate is the places till which they could fight, they could launch a rocket. 3200, 1600, they can hit any part. Now, Cuba, Fidel Castro overthrows corrupt US-backed dictator Batista, nationalizes US-owned factories and estates. Cuba's relationship with the US worsens, USSR improved. In January of 1961, USA broke off diplomatic relationship, Russia increased economic aid. JF Kennedy thereafter approves Batista supporters to invade USA from American bases in Guatemala. CIA was involved. In April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs incident happens, but Castro crushes these forces. Now, February 1962, USSR Premier Khrushchev planned installation of missiles in response to the US-Cuban project. Kennedy goes for a naval blockade, and high tensions are very, very high. Tensions are diffused when US dismantled its missile bases in Turkey, and USSR said, okay, no missiles in Cuba. Jointly, they write a very important statement that a nuclear war was averted. Steps will be taken for the betterment of relationships. And from this point forward, you will see de-escalation will happen. First is what is called the Nuclear Test Partial Ban Treaty 1963, which is no tests in outer space and underwater. But the bane of India's existence, which is the worst treaty which for us, which is the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because this recognized the powers which were nuclear, and no one else was allowed to have nuclear weapon technology, weapons grade uranium, and reprocessing technology, which was allowed. India was not, India never signed this, but we still have access to it. Pokhran was later, and Pokhran was never recognized as a what we call as legal test in that sense. So very simply, the NPT came into existence after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, can we now talk about the détente period? Israel, Palestine, yeah, Israel and Pakistan never signed also, but we are not Israel and Pakistan. Okay. Not important to remember the leaders' names. I'll tell you what to remember. They will ask you these questions. Discuss the escalation points of Cold War politics. What is Berlin blockade? Or they can ask you, how did the world avert a nuclear crisis in the 1960s? Basically, these three moments are where the questions revolve around. Where is the three escalation points? And I hope you understand the context for it. And no class in the evening. You have now the standard weekend batch which will start from 12 o'clock. But the point is simple, straightforward. The period was about aversion of nuclear warfare. So I hope you understand these three major points in this history. Yes? Okay. USSR just created the Berlin Wall. That's it. That was their response to the Berlin Wall crisis. Okay. Now, 1970s onwards, things totally change, which is that there is a period of proper de-escalation, and the reason for that is most unlikeliest and something which comes as a surprise to everyone is China. See, China had been a very, very loyal partner of the USSR since 1945. Yes, Gayatri, you can do that. It had been a very, very loyal partner of the USSR. But if you are a socialist country which has a lot of labor potential and the potential to produce a lot of commodities, would you love to be under a socialist country or a socialist economy? If you have the capability like China, would you want to be under a socialist economy? No. So China in the 1970s realizes that it wants to produce for the world. It has very cheap labor, very big population. But the USSR does not have the demand or the right set of relations to do it. And over and above that, whenever there was an uprising in any of the communist countries, specifically Czechoslovakia, the USSR used to ruthlessly destroy those rebellions. And China also realized one thing, that the USSR, as a lot of you pointed out, was a sinking ship. Dubra. USSR is basically losing this battle. So nobody really wants to be part of a loser. So China in the 1970s shifts its focus away from USSR and goes closer to the Americans. And whilst doing that, USSR now becomes a little bit more nervous. Because if the Chinese are moving towards the Americans, USSR becomes alone, then that combination is also very dangerous. China plus US. And therefore, the Russians also start to change their orientation towards the Cold War politics. As it is, Russia was now very, very low on resources when it comes to vis-a-vis USA. USA had outpaced the Russians. The Russians had now become desperate of more and more economic liberalization, and they were not ready to agree that what Lenin had started and what Stalin had created was a flawed economy and a flawed state. So the weaknesses of the Soviet Union were now becoming more and more evident. Stalin's very grand image had now been also destroyed because of his very bad politics and what he had done. Everybody knows that. Now, with this, USSR also shifts. So as it says that now both people realize, USA and USSR both realize that there is no winner of a nuclear war. And they also realized that there is a better way to manage this than actually go for war. And this is because USA was also becoming frustrated in Vietnam, which I will discuss with you on Monday. So with drain of resources of the USSR and USSR fearing the stability of communist bloc to be actually not be very well, Poland, there was a trade union which is called the Solidarity. Solidarity was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger and stronger. And now the communist regime in Poland was getting challenged by a trade union, a true socialist organization. And the Chinese were very unhappy with the Russian relationship, nervous of the involvement of the Americans in Vietnam, and also wanted to improve the relationship to basically feed the US demand. Solidarity is the name of the trade union. And therefore, with USSR thinking bad relationships with China is not good, and USA and this combination of the USA and the Chinese coming together is dangerous, they will also start to change their orientation. So it is the Chinese who triggered a way, they triggered the change in heart of the USSR. But USSR at this point of time, as it is, has given up. I told you that USSR had already lost the battle when their purpose of holding these countries was to exploit them. But by 1970s, after close to 30 years of fighting this ideological battle, America had now started to show that it was the better power, and as it is, world works on money, and money is with capitalists. And this is why I say that capitalism can never lose, because money makes everything. And USSR was now becoming desperate for money. And imagine the most closest ally of the USSR, China. Why did they go to the Americans? Why did they go to the Americans? They went to the Americans because of what? Because of money. They wanted economy. They wanted economic development. Paisa, money is what matters. And the Americans had that, and they were proving it that is the way to go forward also. Now, whatever I'm discussing to you now are a series of events which will happen. You don't have to learn them, but you just have to enjoy them. Can I discuss these events? And thereafter, we can just end the Cold War also. Yes? Okay. Now, the first reminiscence or first tangible acceptance of détente was in 1972 with what is called the START 1 treaty. START 1, which is Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, was when for the first time both USA and USSR were ready to tell each other how many ballistic missiles they have, which is anti-ballistic missile systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine launch ballistic missiles. So for the first time, they did not reduce the amount of armament, but they tried to now tell each other, okay, I have 3,000 this, 3,000 forehead, this, that. Then comes the Helsinki Agreement in 1975, something which the Soviet Union always wanted. For the first time in 1975, East Germany will be recognized as a country, and now this will make the situation better. But the turning point in Russia comes because of a man who recently died. His name, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, when he came to power, he was seeing what USSR was. And Gorbachev will introduce two very important concepts. Glasnost and perestroika. Perestroika. See, perestroika is opening up of press, wherein he allowed now a little bit of press freedom. Satellite states had a little bit of autonomy. And because of perestroika and glasnost together, there's an economic element which I'm coming to. But first was the opening up of the press. The press was opened a little bit of freedom was there. So more and more anti-Stalin propaganda came out. But perestroika allowed Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania to now have a little bit of breathing space. And this will allow those countries to avert the USSR push. But the most important concept, glasnost, was that for the first time, Gorbachev agreed that the USSR economy is flawed. And basically, he wanted what now we used to have or we have is a mixed economy. He said, let there be socialist run PSUs and nationalist, what we call as factories, but we should open our economy a little bit. Let the market forces come through. Basically, socialism was failing and he wanted a little bit of economic reform so that the USSR economy could get revived. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan will also come together to argue that nuclear war cannot be won but must be never fought. But the turning point in the journey of Gorbachev is going to happen in a Ukrainian city where a nuclear disaster will happen, which is called Chernobyl. In Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster, wherein the core of a nuclear power plant is going to melt because of the shoddy work of the Russians. Here, 5 lakh people will die, 15 to 20 lakh affected for generations. And Gorbachev and the world will actually see the realities of a nuclear war. What it actually meant to have a nuclear war and what it actually meant to have nuclear radiation. This will convince Gorbachev that Russia was on the wrong path and therefore he will now start to ease perestroika and glasnost even further. And this will in turn lead to the first major thing, which is called the 1987, what we call as INF Treaty. INF Treaty, Reagan and Gorbachev came together and they argued that all intermediate range, which is 300 to 3000 miles of ballistic missiles, nuclear warhead based ballistic missiles, we will now destroy them. So for the first time in the Cold War, now these countries started to destroy their arms and ammunition, saying nuclear war should be avoided at all point of time, which you would have heard about this word, nuclear disarmament. Nuclear disarmament starts with the INF Treaty, wherein everybody starts to disarm their nuclear resources and they start to talk about how nuclear war should be avoided. There was an anti-nuclear feeling. Everybody had seen what Chernobyl had done, and now people feared nuclear power. Then after all of this, because of perestroika and glasnost, the Solidarity Trade Union will be able to do what nothing previously was possible. This trade union will have free elections in Poland, and Poland, the Communist Party which was installed by the USSR was defeated. And now in the satellite states, they will start to free themselves from USSR control. Poland is going to be the first, Hungary is going to be the second. But the most iconic moment, which basically marked the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also the USSR, was in 1989, when the communist leader installed by the USSR in East Berlin asked the police to shoot on the people who were protesting against the Berlin Wall. His own colleagues and the police will not allow him to do it. And there will be a takeover of power in East Germany by the people who were in favor of unification of Germany at this point of time. And the communist government would have to resign. And the German Berlin Wall will be breached. And with the breach of the Berlin Wall, the misery of the Germans will come to an end. What started in 1945, they will finally be together in 1989. After that, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania will also overthrow their communist regimes. And by 1991, USSR was on the brink of split. Gorbachev will allow these powers to split. USSR will disintegrate in 1991, giving rise to 15 different countries all across Central Europe and in what we call as Central Asia. Gorbachev had somehow made sure that nuclear war did not happen. USSR changed. USSR now became Russia. From Russian Empire to USSR to Russia. Capitalism had won. USA had won. USA had now become the unipolar power. It had shown that socialism is a sham. The God called socialism had failed. And our story in that sense comes to an end. Done? Perfect. Now on Monday, I will give you the significance of the Cold War, an assessment of USA as a power, and we'll talk about colonization and decolonization and finish the course. Done? USSR declined because of its internal factors. Glasnost and perestroika accelerated it. Okay. So thank you so much. I thank you for coming on.